In the last video, we learned how to defeat the value, and this is very, very, very important. Now we're going to look at strategies for responding to your opponent's criterion, defeating your opponent's criterion. And this isn't as important. In fact, most of the time you may not even need to touch your opponent's criterion. You can just skip it. Many times it's not important to attack that. But there are some strategies you can look out for maybe attacking it if any of these 4 strategies fits. And if it doesn't, don't worry about it. But anyway, the 4 main strategies you can use to attack your opponent's criterion. The first one is if your opponent's criterion does not lead to or go to his value. So remember, the criterion is supposed to be a helper for the value. The criterion is used in 2 ways, right? It's both a way to lead to the value, the criterion leads to the value, and the criterion is a measure of when we've achieved the value. So if the criterion doesn't lead to his value, that's a problem, because usually that's how criterions are used, that first way. The criterion leads to the value. That's the purpose of the criterion. If the criterion isn't doing that purpose, if it isn't leading to his value, or if it doesn't even go with his value at all, that's a huge problem. You can point that out, especially if his value, if your opponent's value and their criterion conflict or they don't fit well together. You can try to show this and break the link. This is very important actually for everything, breaking the links. LD, everything in LD is made up of links. And what I mean by that is you have the value, right? The value is linked to your side of the resolution. Your side leads to the value. There's a link there between the side of the resolution and the value. There's a link between the value and the criterion. The criterion leads to the value. There's a link there. If you can, LD is made up of all these links. If you break one link, then many times the rest of the case falls apart. So try to break the link between the side of the resolution and the value. Try to break the link between the value and the criterion. So that's one way the criterion doesn't lead to or go with his value. The second thing you can argue is that the criterion is unclear or vague. The purpose of the criterion is to make the value more clear and concrete. Now, it's okay if the value is vague. The value is supposed to be vague. It's supposed to be an abstract noun, just this general idea. The value is supposed to be vague to some degree. If the criterion is vague, you have a problem. The criterion is supposed to be clear and concrete. So you can point out the criterion is unclear or vague. It's not a good criterion. And then third is just any problems, or if there are any flaws you can find. You can also argue the opponent's criterion doesn't fit with his case. This is sort of related to what we talked about earlier. Cases are built on links. Try to break the links. Argue your criterion, the opponent's criterion doesn't lead to his value, or maybe it doesn't even fit in with the case at all. It's just totally irrelevant or random, which leads us to this fourth thing, which is also related. Some of these are kind of related, but one other thing you could argue is the criterion is redundant. It's redundant. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, how many times you don't even need a criterion in your case. Many times it just makes everything more redundant and might actually open up more holes for attack. If the criterion doesn't add anything useful to his case, if there's no reason for it to even be there, maybe he brings up the criterion. My criterion is, I don't know, human dignity, and he doesn't talk about that at all during the rest of his speech. He just drops it. You could point out, well, that criterion isn't doing anything. It's just sitting there. It's not adding anything useful. So those are a few ways you can address the criterion. And again, addressing the criterion isn't nearly as important as addressing the value or contentions. Focus on the value, focus on the contentions. If you happen to see one of these, if you want, you can attack the criterion, but it isn't as important. In the next video, we're going to look at something very important though, strategies for rebutting your opponent's contentions. And we're going to look at logical fallacies and all these ways we can attack your opponent's contentions, his main arguments. That's going to be a very, very important video, so I hope you watch it and take notes.